welcome everybody. My name is Iman Mahmood, and I am so excited and honored to be with you here today. As a junior religious studies major with minors in interdisciplinary humanities, as well as Middle East and South Asian studies, Dr. Eboo Patel's ideals truly resonate with me. For over 15 years, Dr. Patel has worked with governments, social sector organizations, as well as college and university campuses to help realize a world where religion is seen as a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division. Tonight, we are in for a treat as President Nathan Hatch engages with Dr. Eboo Patel in a meaningful conversation surrounding his leadership and life. But before we begin, I want to inform you about the Q&A portion of our program. After the conversation, there will be mics in both of the aisles, and we will also be taking questions from Twitter. We ask that you use the hashtag WFULeads. That's WFULEADS. I will serve as the moderator, and we will alternate between questions from the audience and questions from Twitter. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Wake Forest University President Nathan Hatch.
Good evening and welcome. In 2014, Wake Forest began the Leadership Project with the aspiration to engage exceptional leaders from various professions and persuasions. And our goal is really to explore their life more than just their thought. That is, how did they become a leader? We think that's very useful for our community, particularly our students, to learn. Tonight's our pleasure to introduce a very admirable leader, Eboo Patel. He's the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, which aims to bridge religious difference and encourage interfaith leadership. What started with a $35,000 grant has now been transformed into a $4 million national nonprofit. As a result of Dr. Patel's work, he was appointed to serve as a member of President Obama's inaugural Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships, also the Religious Advisory Committee of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the National Committee of the Aga Khan Foundation. And he's received awards for his work from Harvard, Stanford, and Union Theological Seminary. As a pragmatic visionary in the religious pluralism movement, Dr. Patel has journeyed an uncharted path and success as a leader. In college, he observed little conversation regarding religious identity among various groups, and that ignited his passion to do something about it. While studying the sociology of religion at the University of Oxford on the Rhodes Scholarship, Dr. Patel began organizing interfaith youth projects internationally. He describes his journey in his book, Acts of Faith, the story of an American Muslim, the struggle for the soul of a generation, and his most recent book, Interfaith Leadership, a Primer. Today's leadership project promises to be engaging and insightful conversation, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Eboo Patel. Dr. Patel, it's wonderful to have you back on campus. As many of you know, he was our commencement speaker and did a marvelous job in May. So it's great to have you back with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And if you call me Dr. Patel anymore, it's going to make me very uncomfortable.
Okay.
So,
Eboo it is. Right. Let's begin at the beginning and talk about your youth and character. Would you talk about your upbringing and how it shaped your instincts and character?
Sure. I feel like I should be lying down on a couch whenever anybody asks me about my childhood, but maybe I'll tell just two quick stories to kind of illustrate my multiple personalities, if you will, which I think I still have in some ways. One is that frequently as a kid, I would walk into a room a classroom, and I would think to myself, boy, I hope I'm just average in this classroom. I hope I'm just going to be okay. And the teacher would, do a lecture and then ask for questions, and I would let other people ask questions first because I didn't want to ask the first question, and I didn't think my thinking was the best thinking, right? And I was always I was ginger about that. And that is one dimension of my personality. I have all these recollections of being in classrooms as a kid and like thinking to myself as 2 or 3 people ask questions, oh, my question is at least half as good as that, so I'll ask it, right? But the other part of my character is the exact opposite. And I'll illustrate with a story that gets my wife to shake her head and think, who were you every time? So my first swimming lesson at the Elmhurst YMCA, I'm like, 8 or 9 years old. I've never been in anything but a little splash pool before. And so I come out of the locker room, I sit in the bleachers, there's 25 kids there, and the swim instructors are calling out all the kids' names. And it turns out that they know all these kids. So Brian is going over here, and Scott's going over there. So I'm watching all these kids go to their different lanes in the YMCA swimming pool. And I'm the last kid left. And of course, I'm the only brown kid, in the whole place. And I'm very aware of that. So the instructor looks at me and he's like, "You're Eboo." And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "So what are you?" And I'm looking at all these people who've gone to their swimming lanes. And I'm thinking, whatever they can do, I can do. So I'm like, "What's the best level you have?" And the guy's like, "Porpoise." I'm like, "I'm probably just below that." And he's like, "Okay." He points over to the deep end. And he's like, "Why don't you jump in and see what you can do?" And I remember looking at the swimming pool and thinking, I've never been in one of you before. But looking at these other kids and thinking, I can do anything you can do. And walking over to the deep end, and the last thing I hear is somebody pounding on the glass in the visitors, in the observers lobby, which is my mother. As she watches me jump into the pool, sink to the bottom, and the next thing I know, I'm flat on my back on the deck with 6 very worried and angry-looking swim instructors around me. And somebody's like, "Have you ever been in a pool before?" This time I thought I'd come clean, and I was like, "No." But this sense of part of my personality. Yeah, I can do what you can do, right? If you can do that, I can do it. But that's balanced with this, I wonder if I'm going to be average in this room. And it's actually unclear to me which personality is salient at any given time, but it's like these warring characters within me.
How difficult was it for you as a son of immigrants and a Muslim to grow up in an American high school and American culture?
I mean, I guess it is hard to gauge that because in effect it only happens in retrospect, right? So I remember a set of very difficult periods, and then I frankly remember adapting. I remember thinking to myself, okay, so here is how you navigate the lunchroom if you're a brown kid whose name is Eboo. And then that just became second nature, right? And then I get to college, and I realize that there are names for that, like racism. And then I look back and I think to myself, holy cow, there's all these other people who have had the wind at their back, right? And I have had to think, I've had to figure out how to navigate whole bunches of things that other people haven't necessarily had to navigate. And then I feel really sorry for myself. And then I'm in the computer lab in college one day, and I'm typing up, this was back when they had computer labs, right? And I'm typing up a paper, and there's a girl in my sociology class who's sitting next to me who's going like this as my fingers are flying over the keyboard at 60 words a minute. And I kind of look over, and I don't know what brought this up, but I kind of snicker at her. And she looked at me, and she's like, "How many computers did you have in your high school?" I had one in mine. And I think to myself, I had the wind at my back. I just grew up in an area in which every high school student took keyboarding because we were all going to college, right? And so a recognition of the ways in which I had to navigate the world because I was a little bit different, and the recognition in which how 99% of my life has actually been stunningly charmed.
I take it in college you became something of an activist?
I mean,
What excited your passions?
raging bull is what I think my dad called it at one point. So diversity and social justice issues, right? Which for me were very much conflated, and as I pay attention to higher ed identity and diversity and social justice discourse now, I recognize it, and I think to myself, oh yes, I know who I would be at Oberlin. Literally, like if I was 19 now, the way I was 19 then, I know who I would be. And a good amount of it was prompted by reading identity discourse in college and using it to reflect back on, again, how I had navigated what was then a largely white professional middle class world, and thinking to myself, I had swallowed the pill of, to use Bell Hooks' language, white supremacy whole. And so when I was presented with the elixir of identity politics in college, I swallowed that whole too. And it felt good for a long time, and it made sense for a long time. And I wanted people to know. And I wanted people to know what it felt like growing up on the margins and knowing that you existed there and trying to navigate from there.
How did it affect your relationship with your parents?
I gave my dad long lectures on people of color consciousness, a lot. He was generally good-natured about it. He told me to never use the word bourgeois in his house again. If I wanted, my bourgeois dad to pay my bourgeois college tuition, I could leave him alone on that. He did say at one point to me, I shared this with you earlier, when I took to calling myself oppressed a lot, he did say at one point, what percentage of the world do you think would trade your material and political conditions for their own right now? 6.5 billion people in the world, 1995. What percentage would take your life over theirs like this? And if you call yourself oppressed, what term do you have for them? And so it took me a while to fully absorb that, but the recognition that there is a difference between not being at the center of the world and one can be at the margins and not call oneself oppressed. One can say, you have the wind at your back at 50 miles an hour, and I only have the wind at my back at 30 miles an hour. And let's work for a more equitable world without what I now view as somewhat overheated terms, at least when applied to myself.
Yeah. Interesting. Wake Forest is known for our commitment to international study and service, and you refer to your experience in Cape Town, South Africa as being formative. Could you say something about that?
Yes, so Imam Griggs spoke earlier today about being in Cape Town or being in South Africa as probably second only to being in Mecca and Medina, the holy cities of our beloved Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of God be upon him, as a life-changing international travel experience, and it was for me as well. I was there in December of 1999 at the turn of the millennium for the Parliament of the World's Religions, spent most of my time in Cape Town, but also some time in Johannesburg at a farm that was also a site for the struggle, a central site for the struggle, a place where Steve Biko and others came. And it was in Cape Town that I first got a kind of flesh and blood sense of the interfaith nature of social justice movements, and I got it up close and personal with Muslims. And I'm embarrassed to admit this now, but when I first started getting interested in religion, the last religion I was interested in was my own. which was Islam, right?
Why is that?
I think it was an adolescent discrimination against the familiar, right? Anything your parents did couldn't be cool, right? And it was in Cape Town where I met people like Farid Essaq, Ibrahim Musa, Ibrahim Rasool, Imam Rashid Omar, and I realized that there was this thing called the Muslim Youth Movement during the struggle in South Africa, and they played a central role in the struggle. And part of this was Mandela speaking at the Parliament of the World's Religions, and he comes out on stage, and somebody stands up in the back and chants this Kosa praise song, which is the tribe that Mandela's from. And I found it so regal, right? This beautiful chant. And Mandela lets it wash over him, and he points out into the Cape towards Robben Island. And he says, I would still be there where I spent a quarter century of my life if it were not for the Muslims and Christians, the Jews and the Hindus, the Baha'is and the African traditionalists of South Africa working together in the struggle against apartheid. And there was this sense of, wow, like this social justice movement, which releases the evil chains of apartheid, was a movement of people chanting the name of God in different ways, including not at all, and coming together to do this. And people who pray in Arabic were a part of it, and more than a part of it. We're at the center of it, right? Ahmad Kathrada in prison on Robben Island, and this sense of like, hey, Muslims can be heroes too. And when I realized that, when I said that to myself in my mind, it was a surprise. It was a moment of like embarrassment of how is it that I've lived for 22 years without even considering this, you know? And the only thing I can put it down to is an adolescent discrimination against the familiar. My adolescence lasted longer than my teenage years, I'm embarrassed to say.
So how was, you win a Rhodes Scholarship? And
Luck.
I'm sure that's not the case. But how did going to Oxford, elite Oxford, change your point of view, your understanding, and your sense of vocation?
Mm-hmm. So I went to the University of Illinois as an undergrad, right? And I mean, U of I is a very middle class place for the most part, and it was comfortable for me in that regard. You know, I grew up in a professional middle class household. My parents, my dad worked a corporate job for some time, but after that they were small business owners, and so my first memory at Oxford is going to an event at Rhodes House, and Lady Kenny, who was the warden of Rhodes House's wife, I don't even know what any of these titles meant, right? She's greeting people at the door, and she shakes my hand, and she hears my accent, she says, "You're an American," and I said, "Yes," and she said, "Oh, Bill Clinton, charming man. Have you met him?" And I'm like, "Lady, my parents own a Subway sandwich store in Lisle, Illinois, right? Like, what the heck? What do you mean met Bill Clinton, you know?" But there was this, if I was privileged because I could type 55 words a minute going into college, I had no idea what privilege looked like when, you know, a third of the Harvard graduating class applies for a Rhodes. And there's an entire phalanx of people at Harvard and Princeton and Yale who help shepherd you through the process, right? You know this, right? But that blew my mind. And I get there, and all these kids, like we go to, you know, some central, whatever, the pub in the middle of the town is kind of our first night, let's get together. And all the Harvard and Princeton and Yale kids know other people there. And I'm like, how do you know people at Oxford? I never even met somebody who'd been to Oxford, right? Yeah. And then it occurred to me, oh, if you go to Harvard and apply for a Rhodes and don't get it, you just get to Oxford some other way. Look, that's fine. I'm not against that, right? But it was very new for me. And you want to talk about the character in me that was like, oh, I'm going to wait until other people raise their hands because there's no way, you know, I'm hoping I'm of average intelligence in here. That very much came out. And it actually, I want to came out. This is seriously therapy because this is like super helpful for me to talk. I want to tell a couple other stories about this. So, when I was in high school, we did this like brief unit on the Enlightenment, and we learned about John Locke and Voltaire, and I basically thought political philosophy had ended then. When Voltaire died, that was it, right? Like the Declaration of Independence was it. And so to get to Oxford and to hear all these people talking about political philosophy and to think to myself, okay, I'm just going to shut up and like figure out what the reference points are. And then they talk about these like post-Voltaire giants, Michael Sandel and Michael Walzer and I'm like, okay. So Voltaire, I believe, was 18th century. These guys were probably 19th century. And then I find out. I'm listening more, right? Oh, they're not 19th century. Oh, they're alive. Oh, you took a class with him, right? Like, that blew my mind, right? Like, at U of I, generally speaking, you don't take a class with the person who invented the field, right? And this is new for me, right? I had never seen a New Yorker before. But everybody at Oxford is like hanging out with the New Yorkers. So I'm like, all right, me and the New Yorker, one Thursday night. And I look at the cover, and I'm like, I can't even figure out the damn cover. How am I going to understand an article, right? And Oxford is a dark, dank, lonely place. So here I am, like this brown kid in his Oxford dorm room, which I swear to God, this is not like, believing that the world is against me. It's the smallest dorm room in the whole damn town, right? And I'm looking at the cover of the New Yorker, and I'm like, I am never going to fit in here. I'm just never going to figure this place out. And then, of course, you just think to yourself, I'm going to do this, right? I'm going to figure this out. And the other character in me, the character that was like, oh, all y'all can jump in the pool, I'm going to jump in the pool too, right? And I just bought.
Did you find a community?
I just bought my stack of Walzer and my stack of Sandel, and I just like, hey, if you guys are ahead of me on that, what am I going to do but read? Either I can tuck my tail in between my legs and go home, hope that my dad gives me a job at Subway, or I can catch up.
Very interesting. How did you come to decide to invest your life in issues of diversity? And not only that, sort of say, I'm going to start an organization.
I mean, college. And what I mean by that is in college, you start student groups, right? So, and there's all these people like Matt and Chaplain Alman and Imam Griggs around who are paid to tell you how great your idea is for a new student group and to help you start it. And so I started like 8 different student groups when I was in college. And so when I got out of college...
You really took on the administration.
I found the Barbies of the world, and so I had an idea for a student group. And so you find the people who help you start it. And it just seemed to me, when you're out of college, why wouldn't you try to do the out-of-college version of that? And I don't think I ever thought to myself, I'm going to give my life to this. I thought to myself, wouldn't it be a great idea to have a project that brought young people from different religious backgrounds together to do service? Well, why don't we try to figure that out? And then figured something out, and it worked, and I loved it. I'm like, well, why don't we try to do that again? And then we tried to do it again. And then I heard about, if you string together a bunch of projects, you can go get a 1-year grant to do them. So why don't we try to figure that out, right? So
who was your first grant?
Our first grant was from the Ford Foundation, but I will tell you how this happened, right? So we have the idea for Interfaith Youth Corps as a series of youth religious diversity service projects. In 1998, the people who start the organization are all in grad school at the time. So basically what that means is we have stipends that are covering our living expenses, and when we get tired of reading and writing our dissertations, we go run an interfaith youth project, right? we start figuring out that if you can string projects together, you can call it an organization and apply for a grant. So by the time 2000, 2001 rolls around, we're having those conversations. And every time I get in the door to a foundation program officer, and at this time I'm like using my Rhodes Scholar privilege as much as possible. I'm realizing that that's a way into doors, right? I can literally see the foundation program officer's eyes like glaze over when I say religious diversity. Because, I mean, honestly, in, August of 2001, who cares about religious diversity, right? Well, a month later, people start to care about religious diversity. And what basically happened is, after September 2001, I went back to the foundation program officers who had done me a favor or had done a more senior Rhodes Scholar a favor by seeing me. And I said, now do you want to see a proposal from us? And Ford bit. Yeah. That's what happened.
Yeah. So in some ways it really was related to the sensitivities coming out of 9/11.
Yes. And I mean, I think that there's, this is a fact. I am a Muslim who doesn't scare white people that much, right? It's just a fact. Right? And so what I mean by that is, like, if you're a Ford program officer, give it to the Eboo guy, right? He went to Oxford. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He speaks in a way that we can understand. Like, we have a reference point for him, right? He fits in we can locate him. And that's how that happened, right? And it is what it is. Which is to say, you can judge it the way that you want. You can say, wow, isn't it great that these places stretched in the way they stretched? Or isn't it a fact that they're limited in the way that they're limited? But I am not dim enough to think that it is because I am so special that other people gave IFYC a crack. It is also because there's a cognitive map in people's minds that they could locate me in part because of the awards I've won, in part because of the manner in which I talk, in part because I know what it looks like to write a proposal, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's also, the people who were on the front lines, who gave us our first crack, they had to fly these things up the flagpole, were 2 African-American men and a Muslim woman. Mm-hmm. So they had to get things approved up the chain. But they were the first people to take a flyer. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that's random, right? I don't think that that's random. I think that there's this sense of we're going to, you need to fit on the cognitive map of the people who run things here, but we're willing to take a half step out, to take a risk.
So you had the instinct, the entrepreneurial drive to start something. How, after a decade or more, how would you describe yourself as a leader of a substantive organization?
Yeah. So I see the work that we do and myself so differently now than I saw it in 2003 or 2004. Back then, it was so much fun to fly by the seat of our pants, and it felt like Ghostbusters, right? The phone would ring, and it would be the State Department, and they would say, "Can you send staff to Kazakhstan for a speaking tour?" And we sent Cassie, and Tony Blair comes to Chicago and meets with us, and he talks about this idea for this massive conference of theologians, and we say, Mr. Prime Minister, maybe you should consider instead of theologians and documents, that's been done, maybe young people in social action. And he's like, that's a great idea. And we launched the Faiths Act Fellowship, and 3 months later we have 20 people and 3 staff members in East Africa working on malaria, from people from all different religious backgrounds in 3 countries. We loved that back then, 2006, 2007, 2008. And I remember we had a pro bono strategic plan done for us by McKinsey and Company, and the guy who ran that plan became a very important mentor of mine. And he said to me after they got all the data back, he said, "You do realize that you guys sound good wherever you go, but you don't really make a difference. And this is 8 years in, and it's 8 years of like we're on the cover of the Tribune. I mean, all we've gotten is lauded, right? So to hear somebody say, when you look at the facts of things, which is to say, have you left anything behind a year after you have been in a certain place? We called 40 of those places. They all said you put on a good show. None of them said there was anything left behind a year later. You gotta make a decision, Eboo. Is that who you want to be, and is that what you want Interfaith Youth Corps to be? And I realized like I loved the show, and I loved being the show, and I had to make a decision. Was that who I wanted to be? And at the end of the day, it wasn't, and it's not. And
how did the organization have to change?
We started to think. First of all, we had to think about what was a proactive agenda, as opposed to saying yes to whoever called. What could we be really good at? What could we develop craft in, right? And how do we, instead of doing 30 things, how do we do 3 or 4 things, but do them well and do them over the long term, right? How do we not think of ourselves as the show, but think of where we're going as the show, and what we're doing is playing a role, nudging it from Act 2 to Act 3. That's a very different way of thinking, right? It's very different to think, we're going to get on this stage and rock this stage, and people are going to be super inspired, and then go out and do, who knows? Because all we've really thought about is the show. To thinking about what ought a university that engages religious diversity positively, proactively, and comprehensively look like? What role can we play in nurturing that along? How long does it actually take, and are we in it for the long haul? Right? So it's that set of things. I mean, I think that there's an institutional maturation that's taking place. I think that there's a personal maturation there also. One of the nicest things anybody ever said to me, this is like geek heaven, but he looked at me and he said, "You've completed the Weberian cycle in a single person. You've gone from charismatic leader to bureaucratic leader in a single person." I'm like, that's like the best compliment I've ever gotten. That shows you what a geek I am. But this notion of wanting to be the show to how do you build an institution that can make a century-long difference in the question of how a sector, namely higher education, engages interfaith cooperation.
Yeah. Let me ask this question. It seems to me it's a certain dilemma when you're dealing with interfaith matters. People who take their faith seriously, of whatever kind, can easily perceive interfaith cooperation as an attempt to water down faith to some common denominator. So how do you get people who are intense about their faith deeply engaged in interfaith work?
I think that is a central question we ask at IFYC, right? And the straightforward answer to that is to elevate the dimensions of all traditions that are what we call theologies of interfaith cooperation. Mm-hmm. So a friend of mine, Nick Price, an evangelical Christian, likes to say that within the Christian tradition is both the Great Commission, go convert all people, and the Great Cooperation. And one is not necessarily more important than the other. They are operative in different types of situations, right? The interesting thing is, if you were to ask many people, what is the Great Commission? Many people of strong faith, tell me the theology of the Great Commission in your faith. They would be able to cite you chapter and verse, right? There is also the Great Cooperation, and there's a theology of that, which is to say, it is scriptural, there are heroes, there's a hermeneutic, there are moments in history, there's this whole theology, if you will. A huge part of what we do at IFYC is invite people to lift up those dimensions of their traditions, not in a manner that overshadows other dimensions, but in a manner that says there are times in which the Great Cooperation is operative, right? and the Great Commission is secondary, so to speak. And we simply want you to have the theological tools at the tip of your tongue when that is the case.
Yeah.
Other people have done the hard work of the actual theology of this. This is not something that we are inventing. I think the role that we are playing is to encourage its salience.
What do you find are your biggest obstacles? Is it apathy, or is it overt opposition?
Yeah, I mean, obstacles to what?
To fulfilling your dream of sort of building a religiously diverse democracy, but particularly in the higher education arena. So making this a durable project.
So I don't actually see these as obstacles. I mean, I see these as, the metaphor that I use in my new book, Interfaith Leadership, is when a mountain climber comes to the foot of a mountain, she doesn't say, "What the heck are you doing here?" Right? She's not surprised, right? She came to climb the mountain. She prepared for it, right? So if you do interfaith leadership work and somebody says to you, well, my faith seeks to convert people, you shouldn't be surprised. That's the terrain you've chosen to engage on, right? If you do interfaith leadership work and people say to you, actually, I'm more focused on other dimensions of identity, race, gender, sexuality, you shouldn't be surprised. That's the terrain you chose to deal on. You need to prepare for those kinds of things. That is part of the landscape. So I don't know if I view these things as obstacles. I think to continue with this somewhat tortured metaphor, I think that I am the part of the mountain that I'm most surprised about right now is the sense amongst some people that one type of disagreement neutralizes the entire relationship, right? Vaporizes everything else. And it just seems to me that if you are dealing with diversity, the definition of diversity is disagreement. Diversity is not the differences you like. Diversity is the differences you don't like and are uncomfortable with. And so you ought to expect that you are going to disagree with people on fundamental things. And I think that I have been a bit taken aback by what you were talking about this earlier. Andrew Sullivan colorfully and somewhat unpolitically correctly calls the scalping culture in diversity movements, which is, if I disagree with you on something, not only does that vaporize everything else, but I'm going to take your scalp and pin it up against my wall as a trophy that says, don't anybody else ever say these things or think these thoughts. And I just think that it is a matter of reality that the expression of some dimensions of identity is an injury to other dimensions of identity. When Muslims celebrate Eid and they sacrifice goats in that sacred celebration, it is an injury to people who view the killing of animals as sacrilegious, which is wide swaths of religious traditions, Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists. It's the expression of Muslim identity in the celebration of Eid is a violation of what is sacred in another identity. That's just one of 7 gazillion examples, right? And how we figure out how to have a common life together, given the fact that some expressions of some identities are injuries to other identities, I think is the challenge.
I'll ask one last question before we open it up. What do you hope your legacy will be?
I mean, I saw that question on the sheet. That meant your guy Matt thought an awful lot about me. Here's what I remember. So I'll say a couple of things here. Number one, I think at IFYC, we would love the term interfaith leader to become what we call an identity category. So as people identify as social entrepreneurs or environmentalists or human rights activists and aspire to become those things and are willing to do the hard work of, learning the vision and knowledge base and skill set of those things, we'd like people to view interfaith leadership the same way. And I've done my geeky best of putting that all in a book called Interfaith Leadership. I would like, 8 years ago, I'd like to have been the show. I don't want to be that anymore. It's not interesting to me, and it's no longer who I am. I think to myself, I am somewhat aghast that I wrote something akin to a memoir. I would never do that again. My guess is Acts of Faith is a useful book for people at a certain stage, and I'm very glad it's useful, but I cannot believe that I once thought that I was so important that I deserved 200 pages within a red cover to be sold. I would never do that again. It's not who I am anymore, right? I am interested in being a contributor, and I think that that's the best thing to be, to make a contribution amongst other people making a contribution. That's God's grace. I'll say one more thing. When I won the roads at Illinois, a casual friend of mine who was a writer for the Daily Illini wrote a column in which his opening sentences was, he wanted to make his own point in this column, but he said something nice about me up front. He said, Eboo Patel just won the roads. Couldn't have happened to a nicer person. So that was 18, 19 years ago, and I still cherish that. I still cherish the notion that the highest compliment that somebody wanted, couldn't have happened to a smarter person, couldn't have happened to a more visionary person, right? Couldn't have happened to a more brilliant person, couldn't happen to a nicer person. Now that I have kids, and they're 9 and 6, and the way that their baseball coach adjusts their batting stance affects their mood in a game, how much their coach smiles or doesn't smile, how gruff or not gruff their voice is, right? I just think to myself, I want people to think, you'll never meet a nicer guy. It's just a really nice guy. It's very important to me.
Yeah, thank you. We wanted to open up to your questions. So, Iman, yeah.
All right, so a reminder, we're going to be taking questions from Twitter, so please continue to use the hashtag WFULeads, WFULEADS, and we will also be taking questions from the audience, so there are mics in both of the aisles. To start, I have a couple of questions here as well. So, Eboo, who are your faith heroes and why?
Yeah, so now I have a panoply of them, right? But I'll go back to when I first became interested in religion, which was when I was 19 or 20 years old, and was deeply involved in diversity and social justice work at the University of Illinois. I was an anger-fueled activist, and it was not working for me. I was on the edge of burnout. I was not a happy person, and nobody around me was happy either. And somebody mentions to me, have you ever heard of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker Movement? And I went and I read Dorothy Day's work, and there happened to be a Catholic worker house in Champaign-Urbana, and I went and spent time there. And it was just this stunningly simple philosophy of what Christians have committed to do is to live like Jesus lived. And here's how he lived, so we'll do that. Oh, by the way, there's nothing magnificent about this. There's nothing that should be shouted from the rooftops about this. This is just, if you make a Christian commitment, you just give up all of your privilege and live in solidarity with the poor. And I just found that not just the act of it so moving, but the attitude in which it was done, the not calling attention to oneself. This is just what you do, right? And then seeing that in my grandmother a couple of years later, in her version of that, bringing women who had been abused into her home, and basically nursing them back to health and helping them find their place in Indian society. And sometimes that was getting them new teeth, and sometimes that was getting them a good marriage, and sometimes that was, sending them to beauty school for a couple of years. And I remember asking my grandmother, why do you do this? And she, like, kind of a Dorothy Day answer, was like, this is what Muslims do. Nothing big, no fanfare, no newspaper articles, right? Just, and that has always deeply impressed me. And I understand that as a religious ethic. That doesn't mean it is only a religious ethic, but because I encountered it first in religious traditions, that is how I think of it in my mind. Although, I'm impressed with it in what people might call, humanists also, and A. Philip Randolph. But this sense of you align yourself with something cosmic, you follow through on it, and you don't attract. You are not especially impressed with yourself in the process.
Absolutely. At a time where Islamophobia is at an all-time high, what do you think is the responsibility of us as the university generation?
That's a great question. I would say, I'm going to say a couple of things which I'm not sure are going to be totally satisfying, right? One is, I think when it comes to any other religious tradition, any tradition that is not one's own, maybe even including one's own, to learn things that are beautiful about that tradition, I think is so important, right? So things that, in other words, in my mind, the work is not primarily about denouncing bigots. The work is about elevating the dimensions of beauty in a tradition, which begins in one's own mind and speech, that naturally draw other people in. There's a great line by the poet Edward Markham. You drew a circle that drew me out, heretic rebel, a thing to flout, but love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that drew you in, right? And as I have moved from a phase in my life where I'm thinking, like, what's the next show, to thinking, what does it take to make a century-long difference? I think what it takes to make a century-long difference is the elevation of beauty in a tradition, right? That doesn't mean it's the only work that matters. That doesn't mean it's the only work that matters, right? But that is how I approach it now. The other, I want to say a couple of other things. Like, I am an American optimist, and I'm a Muslim optimist. And the reason I say that is because I think both traditions have, like, deep, deep optimism in them. And so I actually look at what's happening in America right now, and I'm like, you do know that the absorption of Muslim culture is happening right before your eyes. You do know that, right? And the manner in which it's happening, right? Let me give you an example. So Muhammad Ali dies in April or May, and he gets virtually a state funeral. Okay, it's like 3 hours carried on ESPN and CNN. Bill Clinton and Billy Crystal are up front, both give talks at the funeral. And in part, of course, Ali is celebrated not just for being a Muslim, but for an Islamic conviction for refusing to go to the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. That is a salient part of the conversation. 3 months later, Khizr Khan gets on the stage at the Democratic National Convention and talks about his son, Captain Humayun Khan, who goes to the Iraq War, even though he might not have made the decision himself, plays the good soldier, goes to the Iraq War, and in effect knowingly gives up his life for his company. And both are viewed as American heroes in 2016. So think about this, right? You can be a Muslim American hero who goes to war. You can be a Muslim American hero whose Islamic conviction requires you to desist from going to war. I don't think that is particularly salient in lots of people's minds that explicitly, but the fact is that these are the two most prominent Muslim American archetypes of the year 2016. And I think what you have is is a deep part of the American psyche at work. The American psyche absorbing a new tradition. Now, I think the full absorption takes decades, right? And if you'll let me go on for just 1 minute more here,
Please
let
continue.
me give you an example of this. So in the late 1950s, 1959, 1960, there is a massive movement in America that says the election of President Kennedy will mean that the Pope will arrive at the White House and the flag of the Vatican will fly in Washington, D.C. This is not that long ago, okay? 1959, 1960. So last October, I am on the south lawn of the White House, 10 feet from my friend Newt Gingrich, by the way, waving the flag of the Vatican as the Pope arrives at the White House. Nobody in America thinks to themselves, oh boy, this is really trippy because now canon law or now, Catholic doctrine is going to permeate the entire country. In 50 years, not even 50 years, we have gone from you can't elect a Catholic light playboy president to 6 justices, Catholic justices in the Supreme Court, and Catholic senior officials everywhere you look. That is an unbelievable change in the American landscape. That is precisely what's happening when it comes to Muslim Americans right now.
In that election, Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina was the first Southern governor to back Kennedy's nomination, and he was denounced from the pulpit by his Methodist minister.
In the Protestant establishment, lined up, no less, and I have great respect for this man, Billy Graham was one of the leaders of the anti-Kennedy movement, right? He hosts a conference in 1959 that effectively locks into place a pattern that leads to what's famously the Peel Conference in October of 1960. The point is that and now actually one way to gain evangelical votes in America is to convert to Catholicism, right? Which is what Newt Gingrich does in 2012. He converts from evangelical Christianity to Southern Baptist to Catholicism and gains a set of evangelical votes along the way. That is a shift in American politics that, nobody saw in 1959.
So, what made you start your own organization instead of going into some easier field?
I'm a brown kid with a chip on my shoulder, honestly, is part of it. There's a part of it that's that juvenile, and I guess there's a part of it that, there's maybe a thread of something a little bit more highfalutin there. But I remember being driven through South Africa to a meeting by the then executive director of the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1999, right? And he looks at me, and he's trying to give me a compliment. He's like, in 20 years, you'll be the one running this. And I was like, why am I going to wait 20 years? And that's like the brashness of a 23-year-old, right?
Absolutely.
And honestly, if I had any idea how hard the next 6 years was going to be, I would never have done it, right? But this is, I think this is part of American optimism, is that you jump in, you dive in, and you think to yourself, this is so hard, but we've put so much time in, there's nothing to do but take the next step. This is so hard, but we're just going to take the next step. We're just going to take the next step. We're just going to take the next step, right? And one day you wake up and you're like, oh man, remember we got a phone call once. Megan was on staff. This is December 2006. This was a period of the organization where I would joke that I slept the number of hours every night that we had months of money in the bank, right? So if we had 6 months of money in the bank, it was a pretty good night. But quite frequently, we had 3 months of money in the bank, right? We get a phone call from an evangelical Christian family in Texas who had met us over the course of the Ashoka Fellowship. And they say, basically out of nowhere, so we will be transferring $3.3 million into your account. And there will be a one-page agreement we fax to you. Don't screw this up. And every once in a while that happens, right?
Right.
So no small part of this, by the way, don't start a nonprofit and hold your breath for that moment, right? But a part of it was, I think that those of us who started the organization had a distinct vision that we recognized could probably not be realized within the context of other existing outfits. I think that that is one leg, and another leg is, and oh, by the way, we're 24-year-olds and we know everything. Mm-hmm. And as those legs start walking, they just continue walking, right? And part of it is we are going to prove people wrong. And part of it is, boy, this is so much fun. And part of it is, hey, we just got an article in Conscious Choice. That was like the biggest thing in the world. When we got an article in Conscious Choice, I'm like, it does not get better than this, right? And it just, I mean, it has been so much fun. I pinch myself every day. I'm like, I cannot believe that God lets me do this, you know?
What do you view as the role of interfaith organizing in amplifying voices and movements such as Black Lives Matter? Excuse me.
I mean, I think it's powerful, right? In fact, one of your professor's sons, Mustafa Abdullah, started the organization Muslims for Ferguson, mm-hmm. right? So probably the first public Muslim community organizer who was like, we are in on this. We are going to be be front and center on this. So I think it is hugely important. I am also a progressive, right? So in the question of what is your view of justice, my view of justice is progressive. I think to expand beyond the specific question around Black Lives Matter, right? Mm-hmm. And again, with a progressive view of justice, it is a movement that I care a great deal about and have a strong view on. I think one of the interesting things about dealing with diversity, especially religious diversity, is the recognition that there are diverse, differing and disagreeing views on justice. Mm-hmm. So when people say, you know, does your interfaith organization work for social justice? My question is often an evangelical's version of justice, in which the legality of abortion is probably the most unjust thing happening in America today. If we take religious identity seriously, why would we not take that seriously? Isn't that a view of justice, right? Or a view of justice that might be from a Reformed Jewish tradition, or a view of justice that might be from a Kurdish position, right? I remember meeting Neckervan Barzani, who was introduced to me as an Iraqi leader, and this is 2007, 2008, and my American progressive sense of justice meant that I instinctively apologized to him for the Iraq War. And he looked at me as if he didn't understand what I was saying. And he had me repeat it, and I said, I apologize for the United States government destroying your country in the invasion in Iraq. And then I realized that he could understand what I was saying. He just couldn't believe I was saying it. And he basically spat at me and said, I am a Kurd. And the only unjust thing about the Iraq War is you didn't take Saddam out 20 years ago. And what was amazing to me in that moment was, why is it that my instinctive interaction with Barzani was believing that he was going to agree with me on what can be called a progressive vision of justice. And if I look at the Iraq War from the perspective of Kurds, of whom tens, if not hundreds of thousands were massacred genocidally, like chemical gas, by Saddam Hussein, do I really disagree with his definition that justice was the taking out of Saddam Hussein? I don't. So if I take his identity seriously, and by the way, isn't the definition of diversity work taking people's identity seriously? If I take his identity seriously, I have to take his definition of justice seriously. That doesn't mean I agree with it. It just means that I can't assume that everybody in the room has the same definition of justice, right? And that at some point, one has to negotiate multiple visions of justice, oftentimes based on identity.
As your own children go through schooling, what do you hope that they experience?
So my son Zaid has taken to coming to my speeches in Chicago and getting in the Q&A line and asking a question. He's at the stage where he likes the show. And he says to me a couple weeks ago, I kid you not, Dad, when you die, can I take over Interfaith Youth Corps?
Hereditary.
That's exactly right. He got that from, some Indian or Islamic idea of hereditariness, I think. I'm like, it doesn't really work that way, to which he was very disappointed. I hope my kids, first of all, I hope that they live in a country that welcomes who they are and that allows them to contribute, right? And one of your questions, President Hatch, was about travel. And one of the things I found in my travels, as much as I love India and South Africa and Kenya, and as much as, I'm not sure I love England, but as much as I appreciated my time in England, one of the things that I will say is in my travels, one of the things that I found so unique in thinking about America is how it not only welcomes but requires the contributions of its citizens. Right? That's the definition of democratic civil society. It requires the contribution of citizens. And I think about so many of my heroes in America and how many of them never held elective office. MLK never held elective office. Jane Addams never held elective office. But they're American heroes. Why? Because they contributed as citizens. And I think to myself, it is remarkable to live in a country that allows and invites you to contribute. To say, hey, you have that crazy idea called Interfaith Youth Corps, you build that thing. Build that thing.
Absolutely. We're going to take a question from the audience.
Yes. I want to thank you. I'd like to affirm what you're doing for society here. I wonder if you're familiar with an international organization called United Religions Initiative. If so, or do you collaborate, or do you do some parallel things? Secondly, I'd ask you if this organization that you're leading now has been financially rewarding too.
Financially rewarding personally or organizationally? So I'll answer both questions. So actually, IFYC was founded at a United Religions Initiative Global Summit in June of 1998 at Stanford. So there were a group of young people there who, watched the interfaith panels of religious leaders and theologians and thought to ourselves, as useful as this is, it's not in the vernacular of young people. And we wanted to build something that spoke more directly to the thoroughbreds in our own hearts, and we thought to other people like us. And so it was started with the strong support of the leadership of URI at the time, Charles Gibbs and Bishop Swing, and actually the current director of the United Religions Initiative is a good friend of IFYC's from college chaplaincy. His name is Victor Kazanjian, and he was, in a lot of ways, he's credited with taking the standard model of a Protestant chaplaincy at a university campus and transforming it into a multi-faith chaplaincy. So now he's the head of the organization, and we maintain close relationships. So has IFYC been financially rewarding? You know what? Frankly, now it is. Not in a for-profit way. We're a nonprofit organization, but our staff gets paid really well, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that. We're actually a $6.5 million organization now, and we pay for excellence. We are the kind of place where, when we all started, I'm looking at my friend and colleague Megan getting a little misty-eyed. It's 11 years ago. We were like 26, 27. Most of us were not married. A couple of us were just getting married. Now, on a staff, then it was like a staff of 4, and I literally every other month would come back and have a conversation with my wife. If we don't get this grant, I'm going to have to take $500 less for the next couple months, right? Which is the way every organization starts. But there was a sense of we're in it together. And as IFYC has attracted significant philanthropic investment, and what I mean by that is there are a handful of significant philanthropists for whom interfaith cooperation is a signature cause, and have decided that they're going to make big investments in IFYC because they view us as the organization that is helping to lift the tide that is lifting all boats in interfaith work and higher education, right? And so they've made significant investments, and we have built out an organization based on that. So now, so many of us are married with kids. And we just frankly would not be at IFYC if the salaries were what they were in 2007 and 2000. We couldn't be, right? But we have been able to build an organization that grows with and keeps its leadership, its best people. Incidentally, I don't negotiate my own speech stuff because I am uncomfortable with money. I don't like naming what the honorarium is. I have other people at the organization do it. I am still a little bit uncomfortable with this. And I also know that we have a staff that when something comes up on a Saturday night that they have to deal with, they're not saying to themselves, I don't get paid for this. They're saying to themselves, I do get paid for this. I get paid for excellence all the time, right? And it seems to me that it is worthwhile paying people sustainable salaries for that kind of work.
All right, we have time for one more question, so we will take it from the audience.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I'll just look for a comment. People without homes will not quarrel with their leaders. This is well known amongst our principal men now engaged in forming an imperialism of capital to govern the world. By dividing the people, we can get them to expend their energies in fighting over questions of no importance to us except for the common herd. Thus, by discreet action, we can serve for ourselves what has been generally planned and successfully accomplished. This is the Banker's Manifesto from 1898. Could you comment on that as we see it today?
So I did not catch all of that.
Okay, what I'm saying is, with everything that's going on in our government, in the world, in our communities, we spend a lot of capital and energy on fighting over HB2, abortion rights, things that should be granted by our Constitution as rights for every American. But we're in courts fighting for the right to vote, for women, the right to do what they want with their bodies, and so on and so forth. Now, as a religious leader, what do you feel about this comment? And remember, we're supposed to have separation of church and state in this country, which seems like every year the line is getting a little grayer, more blurrier.
Right. So thank you for your insight. So first of all, I'm not a religious leader. I'm a civic leader. I run a civic organization, and I am committed to a religious tradition. And the purpose of the civic organization is to work with people across a range of diverse religious and philosophical identities. That's just a disclaimer I have to say. It happens to be true also. So I would much prefer that people in a diverse democracy negotiate their differences in courts than on battlefields. And I mean that very seriously, right? The definition of a religiously diverse democracy is a place where people who disagree on fundamental things and ultimate concerns can make those disagreements public. Things like, when does life begin? What should public structures look like, etc. I have views on all of these things. From what you're saying, my sense is my views are in the same general world as your views. And I live in a society in which people have different identities than me and different views than me. And the question is, how in a country of 325 million people do we live together? And one of the ways that we live together is when people of different views cannot work out an agreement, things go for votes to legislatures. Oftentimes when a legislature runs afoul of a constitution, or somebody doesn't like what the legislature how the legislature legislates, they take it to court. And it seems to me that is the American system working right now. Some of this I view as ridiculous. I do not think that people should be relitigating their right to vote. I think that that's ridiculous. I think that there are other things, like the question of abortion, on which I have a progressive view and have great respect for other views. And it feels to me like that continuing to be a conversation feels very justified to me.
All right, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Now I pass it on to President Hatch to leave us with some closing remarks.
Eboo, you have graced us with your presence. Thank you for your honesty, your humility, and your deep wisdom. Join me again in thanking Eboo Patel. And thank you all for coming, and good night. Thank you.
Yes, fun. Lots of fun. Nice to meet you. Thank you. You did a really nice job.